Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Habarigani, this is Sister Thage welcoming you to the liberated zone of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist and internationalist world affairs program. Today, we have a tight agenda bringing you 3 full interviews this Freedom Now Hour of Power. Our central theme today is new directions in slavery studies, from underwater to cyberspace. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Ayana Omilade Flewellen, archaeologist and assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford University and board member of Diving with a Purpose. Then, Dr. Horne interviews Daniel Domingues, associate professor of history at Rice University in Texas and author of the book The Atlantic Slave Trade from West Central Africa, 1780 to 1867, and host of the website slavevoyages.org. And to close out this hour, Dr. Horne interviews Gunja SenGupta, professor of history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and co-author of the book Sojourners, Sultans, and Slaves, America and the Indian Ocean in the Age of Abolition and Empire. You don't want to miss this hour. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Pharoah Sanders, Pancho Sanchez, Eddie Harris, Miles Davis, and more. So sit back, tell a friend, and as always we stand, ready for revolution.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK Los Angeles, and with me on the line is Ayana Omilade Flewellen, archaeologist and assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford University in California, co-founder and current president of the Society of Black Archaeologists, and a board member of Diving with a Purpose. Thank you for joining us on KPFK's Freedom Now, Los Angeles, Professor Flewellen.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to share more about my work.
Well, thank you for joining us. And so what is Diving with a Purpose?
Yeah, so Diving with a Purpose is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to oceanic conservation and preservation of submerged heritage resources. So what that amounts to is an organization really dedicated to coral reef conservation efforts, both here in the United States and abroad, and an organization really dedicated to documenting and locating submerged heritage, generally pertaining to the African diaspora. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And given the fact that overwhelmingly the Black population arrived in North America aboard ships, I take it that gives Diving with a Purpose quite an agenda.
Oh, absolutely. So Diving with a Purpose, we were founded in 2003 by Brenda Lazendorf, who at the time was a staff member with the National Park Service, who's since passed, and Ken Stewart, who's based in Nashville, Tennessee. And at that time, we were really founded around, Brenda Lazendorf's desire to locate a vessel that was known to have carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, called the Guerrero. So that particular vessel is what really set the foundation for Diving with a Purpose, that partnership with the National Park Service. And I remember Ken, when he talks about the story of the founding, he sent out an email to members of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers and was like, are you tired of the same old dives? How about you dive with a purpose? And this purpose. Yeah, this purpose really being having a different relationship to water in general, but also having a real sort of stake in the documentation of our history in the Atlantic more broadly.
So how did you get involved in scuba diving?
I got involved in scuba diving because of Jay Hagler and Kamal Siddiqui, who were board members of Diving with a Purpose in 2016. And they reached out to an organization that I co-founded, the Society of Black Archaeologists, with Dr. Justin Donovan, who's now teaching at UCLA. And Kamal and Jay had already built a long-standing partnership with the Slave Wrecks Project, which is this international organization that's really built from the kind of core foundation of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture and George Washington University and the National Park Service. So DWP was doing work really helping to cultivate stewardship and training in these different arenas, both, on the west coast of Africa and Senegal and in South Africa, and then doing some work here in the United States. And Jay and Kamal were really interested in getting archaeologists who were based here in the United States of African descent a part of this project. So they reached out to Justin and I and was like, hey, y'all have this really awesome organization. Do y'all have any maritime archaeologists? And at the time, there were really only 2 archaeologists that Justin and I had known of that had really pursued maritime archaeology in any earnest. So we were really open to the idea of not only being trained ourselves, but being able to be part of a project that could create pathways for other people of African descent to be able to do this work, because quite frankly, maritime archaeology can be a rather exclusionary discipline, mainly because of the cost. It's cost prohibitive. There aren't a lot of schools and universities that do that particular training for students more broadly. And then the job market, once you have this degree, can be quite slim. So it's not really the space where you see a lot of folks of color more broadly. So we were really excited about the opportunity.
So you did a dive into Cape Biscayne off of the waters of Florida. What did you find?
Yeah, so my first time diving with, being a part of Diving with a Purpose, our summer training program was in 2017. And we do a training program with NOAA in the National Marine Sanctuary in Key Biscayne, Florida. And it was during that time where we actually were documenting the Henna and Belle, which isn't a ship that pertains to the transatlantic slave trade. I want to say it's like a mid 20th century vessel, actually, or early 20th century vessel, actually. But it was my first time documenting and surveying a ship underwater, which is completely different than my training as a historical archaeologist that in large part has done work on land. So taking those kinds of skill sets and bringing them underwater was a totally different experience. But it was truly amazing to be a part of an organization, Diving with a Purpose, that was providing this kind of training to, archaeologists like myself who have a degree in terrestrial archaeology, a real foundation in it, but for the most part to recreational scuba divers who have their professions elsewhere, who were really interested in, once again, being a part of a program that provided them opportunities to be in relationship with water that was different than the kind of touristy relationship that's generally been sort of pushed forth with, recreational scuba diving. So it also is just a really fantastic opportunity in that regard to be in conversation and community, not just with people who have this sort of professional undergirding in this work, but like with folks who have a genuine interest in this history and wanting to be a part of unearthing this history.
So you've also studied the remains of enslaved Africans in Florida. What have you learned?
Yeah, so my first archaeological experience was at the Kingsley Plantation site, which is a National Park Service site off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, on Fort George Island. And we actually excavated that year, I think it was 2009, and we excavated in the home spaces, but also a large part of that project that was run by Dr. James Davidson at the University of Florida was really centered on locating and demarcating the burial grounds for the enslaved Africans that lived and labored at the Kingsley Plantation in the 1800s. So that particular project, as my first sort of archaeological experience, was really eye-opening to not only show the kind of present-day impact that archaeology can have, because at the Kingsley Plantation, there's a large public archaeology aspect to it. There's also a large descendant engagement project that happens at that plantation. And, you know, excavating inside of the enslaved homes actually gifted me the opportunity to see a different side of slavery that I wasn't exposed to in my undergraduate or high school classes that really talked about the everyday lives of enslaved Africans, being able to come across, you know, the plates that people ate off of, the toy fragments that children played with, the actual metal implements that folks had buried in the entryway of their homes that really spoke to the kind of vivid aliveness of their spiritual lives, was really quite eye-opening for me to have that tangible access to history.
Now, apparently there are 1,000 unmapped sunken slave ships with ties to the transatlantic slave trade. I take it that Diving with a Purpose plans to explore at least some of these sites. And what might that tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the number is so, it's so startling. So really from the Slave Voyages database, which is where these numbers are coming from, there were over 12,000 ships, right, that made this crossing across the Atlantic and between the 16th and 19th centuries. And you're absolutely correct. Over 1,000 of them have likely sunk, and less than 10 have really been documented. So there's all of this history, right, that are in the waters surrounding us, and the waters that, you know, are still these transatlantic crossways for many people. And the kind of history that we're able to learn from this space, beyond just, you know, the kind of despair, real, and the harsh conditions of enslaved Africans that made that crossing, but really, you know, here in the United States, in this country at this time that is so deeply where there are some individuals who are deeply dedicated to revisioning African diasporic history, indigenous history as well, and not really sharing the fullness of this history. These shipwrecks actually become the tangible history that's needed to really say that these events took place, right? That this crossing took place, that the ways in which this country was founded were based upon this movement of bodies across the Atlantic. So part of what this work is really doing is actually saying that this took place and really rooting our history into the tangibility of it with the actual vessels themselves. And then a lot of this work, especially for people in Diving with a Purpose who are doing it, who are often folks of African descent, there's a real deeply healing aspect to doing this work as well, and really thinking about transforming the kind of historic relationships that Black and African diasporic people have had with water in the Atlantic because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of the ways in which people were denied access to beaches and pools throughout the 20th century in this particular country. So the history itself that these ships hold has so much to do with the physicality of the ship, but also the symbolism that resides from them in African diasporic communities.
Now, to that end, what was the Clotilda and what is Africatown?
Yeah, so one of the more hyper visible projects that Diving with a Purpose has been a part of in collaboration with Search, as well as the state of Alabama has been in helping to document the Clotilda wreck site. And the Clotilda is the last known vessel to have brought enslaved Africans into the United States. And it arrived in, Mobile, Alabama, and Mobile Bay. I want to say it's either 1859 or 1860. But this particular shipwreck is the most intact vessel that has been documented to date that enslaved Africans were carried on, and the kind of tangibility, I want to say that word again, that the Clotilda offers is that, the descendants of the enslaved Africans who were brought on that ship then, created this town called Africa Town. And for so many of us of African descent, myself included, who have deep ties to Texas that date back to the 1800s, we will never know the name of the vessel that brought our ancestors across the Atlantic. We don't have those names, and the descendants of those who are living in Africa Town today have those names, right? They have that vessel. They have a very clear sort of tangible connection in ways that many African Americans can only dream of being able to experience. So the Clotilda itself is remarkable in its own regard because of the kind of intact nature of the vessel itself. But when people are having these conversations about the legacy of slavery, nowhere else in the United States is it more clear about the legacy of slavery and the ways in which it continues to shape and mold a community than you see between the Clotilda, the family that brought that vessel across the waters and paid for it, and the actual descendants of the enslaved Africans that were brought there that now live and reside in Africa Town. So there are ways that conversations around, educational access, economic access, environmental racism that are shaped by slavery, that are shaped by the legacy of slavery, is so clearly seen between the Clotilda and Africa Town. So that's really the kind of clearest articulation I have of the Clotilda. And then for me, it was the first vessel that I've dove on that was once again, a vessel that brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. And, the Mobile River is round. So the diving itself is not the kind of clear, pristine waters that we have in Key Biscayne, Florida, where I tend to dive off the coast of St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It's black water diving, essentially, which means that if I hold my hand out in front of me, I can't see. But there are lots of other mechanisms that Search was using to be able to actually sort of demarcate the outline of the vessel itself. And then when divers were ground truthing it, a lot of the work that we've done, and you'll hear Kamal Siddiqui talk about this, was really seeing with your hands and really being able to feel your way around the vessel and feel your way into the hull of that ship, which made it a different experience because it required you to release your sort of reliance on sight itself as a way of knowing, to really allow yourself to feel your way into that space. So it was really a different experience for me. I'm still, sitting with, over a year ago that this took place, with the kind of impact that it's had on my own life. And it was an experience.
Finally, Professor Flewellen, archaeologist, assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford, a compound question. Would you recommend students applying to study with you at Stanford University? And second, what advice would you give to a young Black woman who wants to be the next Professor Flewellen?
Absolutely. I would love and welcome applicants to Stanford's anthropology department, the archaeology track. It is my hope to be part of the kind of legacy that my own mentor, Dr. Maria Franklin at UT Austin, did, where she had a very robust program for graduate students and had a keen desire to train women of color, Black women specifically, to do this kind of work. And I'm also dedicated to that as well. And I'm dedicated to training individuals that want to really talk about and peel open the experiences of the African diaspora, be it in my own sort of space where I do work now in the Caribbean or on the continent of Africa or here in North America. So I very much welcome applications from students who are interested in really wanting to do this work. And for young Black women who are thinking about being, entering into this field, I really want to say that, the kind of work that we're able to do in terms of centering the experiences of Black women in the past and the kind of tangibility of doing that with the very objects that they use to create their own lives is really a special place to exist in, to explore, to really peel open. So I want to just tell women who are interested that do it, be open to the possibility that this could be a space where you could thrive, in a space that needs your voice as well.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Flewellen, archaeologist, assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford University, Northern California, co-founder and current president of the Society of Black Archaeologists, and a board member of Diving with a Purpose. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And now we go to our interview with Professor Daniel Domingues.
From KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Daniel Domingues, Associate Professor of History at Rice University in Texas, author of the book, The Atlantic Slave Trade from West Central Africa, 1780 to 1867, and host of the website slavevoyages.org. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, Los Angeles, Daniel Domingues.
Thank you very much, Gerald. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So what is slavevoyages.org and how did you get involved?
Slavevoyages.org is a database that records information on voyages of ships and the people carried and involved in the voyages of these ships across the Atlantic and between places within the Americas, from the 16th century all the way to the middle of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. And I became involved in this project when I was a college student.
Mm-hmm. Now, is it possible to track vessels carrying enslaved Africans arriving in, for example, Veracruz, Mexico, or Galveston, Texas, or New Orleans, Louisiana, etc.?
Yes, that's the purpose, to track their voyages across the Atlantic and between ports within the Americas. So we do have information about ships arriving directly from Africa or ships coming from other ports in the Americas, to places like Galveston, for example, and bringing on them enslaved Africans or enslaved African Americans.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of what parts of Africa these enslaved individuals were arriving from, in terms of the United States in that regard, is it fair to say that the plurality were arriving from the Congo-Angola region? Or was it the Senegal-Gambia region, or perhaps another region?
Yes, the traffic, the direct traffic to what would become the United States It was actually a minor player in the overall transatlantic traffic. But when we look at the records that we have about the origins or places of embarkation of the ships carrying enslaved Africans to what ultimately became the United States, we can see that the vast majority came from West Central Africa, from the Congo, Angola region. Other regions were also important. The Senegambia region, now covered there by places like Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, right? And places like in Nigeria were also important points of origins for Africans transported to the United States.
So how comprehensive is slavevoyages.org? I mean, what percentage of the vessels crossing the Atlantic do you surmise your database includes?
Focusing on the transatlantic slave trade alone, we think we have about 80% of what was, the transatlantic slave trade. So we do have some gaps in our database, especially in the earlier periods, the 17th century, places like Brazil mainly. But as we move forward on time and with more research, we look forward to cover these gaps. I don't think we will account for the whole traffic, like having 100% coverage, but I think we can still find more information about voyages that crossed the Atlantic and delivered enslaved Africans to the Americas.
Where do you search for information about these voyages that you have not yet found?
Well, there are researchers working on archives in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas. There are states archives, private archives, church archives, really digging information about ships that crossed the Atlantic in that period. There's still significant research to be done, and it is very challenging because it also requires language training and the ability, right, of reading cursive of 17th, 16th century.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn to your book. Why did you write this book, The Atlantic Slave Trade from West Central Africa, 1780 to 1867?
I wrote this book because I was interested in trying to trace the inland origins of Africans forced into the transatlantic traffic. And when I was in graduate school at Emory University, I embarked on 2 research trips to Angola, and I came across this very interesting set of records called Registers of Slaves, made in Luanda, Benguela, and places in the interior of Angola in the middle of the 19th century. At the same time, I was working with another set of records related to the liberation of Africans from slave ships during the course of the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade, made in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and in Cuba. And these records, they provided interesting information about the ethnonyms, that is, names associated to the ethnicities of the Africans transported. And I thought that if I could use these records in combination or in conjunction with what we know about the evolution of the slave trade from various ports along the coast of West Central Africa, that would give me a better idea to determine first, more or less, the inland origins of the Africans sold into the traffic from that region, And second, the relative importance of one people forced into the trade over another. Yeah. And thereby, I thought it would be an important contribution for people to understand the origins of the vast majority of the people transported to the Americas, and also an insight of what was happening in the interior of West Central Africa during that period, the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a moment ago the term liberation, unquote, quote unquote. What did you mean by that term? I mean, these are people who were freed from enslavement, or did you mean something else?
Yeah, so in the 19th century was an important period in human history when all these ideas about freedom, liberty, as well as slavery, servitude, and so on were being discussed. And a lot of the nations at the time, or some of them, were deeply involved in shifting their attitudes towards slavery and engaged in a campaign to suppress the slave trade. Slavery, but beginning with the transatlantic slave trade. So they fought this campaign in two fronts, right? The diplomacy and through naval power. Right? So they organized patrols, right, of ships along the coast of Africa and along the coast of the Americas with the intent of intercepting slave ships in violation of international treaties and capturing these ships and taking them to international courts, initially international courts, but later almost exclusively British vice admiralty courts. And once they adjudicated the case of the ship, if the ship was found guilty, the authorities would then liberate the Africans from that slave ship. Right? They did not return them to their homelands. Right? They stayed mostly in the places where the ship was taken to. Right? But they never experienced what hundreds of thousands of Africans who preceded them, right, experienced in Americas. That is to say, slavery.
Mm-hmm. So they were taken to places like Sierra Leone, for example, in West Africa, I assume.
Correct. Sierra Leone, Havana, Rio de Janeiro, Santa Helena, the Cape of Good Hope. All these locations had these international courts or British vice admiralty courts that participated in that endeavor of suppressing the slave trade.
Mm-hmm. Now, in preparing for our talk, I read a review you did of a book on the slave trade from Madagascar, the gigantic island off the southeast coast of Africa. And in that review, you said that the indigenous of Madagascar, that is to say the Malagasy, they stood out insofar as they had straighter hair, lighter complexions, etc. Where did the enslaved from Madagascar mostly wind up? Did any of them arrive in the United States, for example?
Yes, that review is actually the author of the book that makes those points, and I agree with her, Wayne Wilsonfall. And yes, there are cases of Malagasy who were enslaved at some point and end up in the Americas. In the case of the United States, there are evidence that some of them were transported to places like Virginia, Maryland, right, in the 18th century, second half of the 18th century.
Mm-hmm. Now, as your website, slavevoyages.org, tends to attest, computerization and the scientific and technological revolution has fundamentally transformed our ability to understand the past. And I'm wondering if you have any speculation on what could be the impact of artificial intelligence on the understanding of the past?
Oh, yes, that's a very interesting question, and I'm also observing what's going to happen. I, to be honest, don't have any clues, right? What I hear from the discussions about the use of AI or machine learning in digital history projects or any humanities project in general is that they're able to create or concoct narratives, right, that may inspire authors and users or readers, and may bridge the gap, may provide inferences, right? But I don't know exactly what's going to happen. We currently don't use AI in our project, right? We do make projections, inferences ourselves, using statistical models, right? Traditional statistical approaches, right? But it's all human created, right? We don't have a machine doing those things for us. We have looked at that opportunity or that possibility in terms of bridging gaps, right, or providing, making projections based on existing information about what was, for example, what might have been the slave trade to 17th century Brazil, for example, right, or what was the mortality rate in different segments of the traffic over different time periods. Those are some of the uses that we would make of AI and machine learning in our project if we indeed go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of directions, what's next on the research agenda for Professor Domingues? What do your loyal readers have to look forward to?
Well, I am developing researches on different fronts, right? Because the website slavevoyages.org is expanding to different directions. So, for example, I've been involved in expanding the intra-American slave trade database with information about voyages coming from different parts of Brazil to Rio in the 19th century. There was a huge internal slave trade in Brazil, especially following the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. And that one extended into the 1880s. Another front is on the coastwise traffic to Texas. Ships leaving ports like New Orleans and Mobile, Savannah, going to all over the coast of Texas, but especially Galveston. Right, so I've been involved with that. And another area that I've been involved is expanding the database into the Indian Ocean and parts of maritime Asia. We got a grant to create a database of voyages, of ship voyages carrying enslaved people across the Indian Ocean and parts of Asia. So we are working in that direction as well.
What parts of Asia?
We're looking at the east coast of Africa, the Persian Gulf, right, both coasts of India, and places as far as China and the Indonesian archipelago.
So we have a youthful audience at Freedom Now KPFK, and would you recommend young scholars who are interested in exploring the African slave trade to come to Rice University in Houston, Texas, in order to study and research and write?
Absolutely. We are experiencing here a moment of growth at Rice University with the development of the Center for Africa and African American Studies. We have hired more professors in those areas. Slave Voyages is currently being hosted right here at Rice University. So yes, this will be an ideal moment for anyone interested in studying Africa or the African diaspora to come to Rice.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Domingues, Associate Professor at Rice University in Texas, host of slavevoyages.org and author of the book, The Atlantic Slave Trade from West Central Africa, 1780 to 1867. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much, Gerald. It was a pleasure.
Ditto.
And now we go to our next interview with Professor Gunja SenGupta.
From KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Professor Gunja SenGupta, Professor of History at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and co-author of the book, Sojourners, Sultans, and Slaves, America and the Indian Ocean in the Age of Abolition and Empire. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor SenGupta.
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Horne. We're delighted to be here.
And we're delighted to have you. So why did you write this book along with your co-author?
Well, our objective was to cross-fertilize the histories and historiographies and epistemologies of the United States with this very rich and burgeoning scholarship on the Indian Ocean. What our book does is to broaden and reframe the story of American slavery and American freedom by crossing its Atlantic boundaries and stepping into the Indian Ocean world. And why do we do this? Because as the 19th century dawns, capitalism, empire, and various technologies of print, transport, communication, information technologies, right, of the 19th century knit the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds into international networks of encounter, of exchange, of contest. So that basically what you have is this global public sphere, a common framework for debating the meaning and merits of slavery and freedom. So that something that happens in rural India, for example, an experiment to grow cotton with free labor, could reverberate in the slavery politics of Mississippi. And so what we do is to use multinational archives to flesh out on a granular level the interface among the personal, domestic, and international politics of slavery and freedom. And we do this by tracking the circulation of people, the echo of ideas, and the resonance of policy among nodes of commercial exchange, imperial power rivalries, and reform activism. And our narrative canvas, of course, extends all the way from Anglo-America through the Swahili coast of East Africa, the Red Sea, and the Arabian-Persian Gulf into South Asia. Mm-hmm. And the reason that as U.S. historian, from my perspective as a U.S. historian, this story interested me so much is that Americans on all sides of the slavery debate are intricately networked into intercontinental coalitions in the 19th century, right? So these coalitions include, on the one hand, human rights activists and oppressed peoples, and they are pitted against multinational slavers and defenders of servitude in different guises, from Charleston to Calcutta and Salem through Kutch to Zanzibar. And so we tell their stories. We move through disparate local and global locales, from Caribbean emancipation celebrations in Northampton, Massachusetts, to the counting houses of American consuls and merchants in Zanzibar. We visit cotton farms run by Mississippi overseers in India. and the magnificent estate of a Union soldier turned slaveholding sugar planter in the Comoros. We traversed the slaving paths of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula into the mercantile establishments, plantations, and zinanas, or women's quarters, of the household of the Sultan of Zanzibar. And we crossed the ship decks of slavers and anti-slavers into safe houses and police stations of South Asian towns on the trail of enslaved women and children. And along the way, we meet East Africans fleeing to Massachusetts on American merchant ships, Africans landed in India on Arab vessels, and Indian concubines in the Persian-Arabian Gulf, among many other characters.
Now, as suggested, your book deals mostly with the 19th century,
yes,
but you also discuss ties between East Africa,
yes,
and Asia, particularly India, before the advent of the Atlantic slave trade. Talk to us about that relationship.
Yes. Well, Africans had been showing up in India for many, many centuries. And I think what certainly my students find rather surprising is that many of these Africans rose through military service, for example, or through various patron-client relationships to positions of very great power. So, for example, you have what we call Siddhi communities, who were warriors and diplomats and kings and kingmakers on the west coast of India. But the nature of slavery changes in the 19th century with the emergence of, pearl fisheries and date plantations in the Arabian Peninsula, clove plantations on the Indian Ocean. And many Indian traders, Gujarati-speaking traders, for example, on the west coast of India, come to be networked with Arab and African and indeed American business partners. They begin slave trading businesses to supply the mines and plantations of Brazil, Cuba, as well as islands in the Indian Ocean.
Now, in your opening remarks, you mentioned this character, or at least I've heard you mention this character, Dr. Benjamin Wilson, who is the subject of one of your latter chapters, who was a fascinating figure. Who apparently fought in the U.S. Civil War in the United States against the enslavers, but wound up becoming an enslaver himself as the 19th century unfolded post-U.S. Civil War. Talk to us about Dr. Benjamin Wilson.
Yes. So he is among these, fascinating American characters who moved to the Indian Ocean during different periods of the 19th century as would-be settler colonialists. And so he ends up, he makes his way to South Africa initially after the Civil War, and on an American merchant ship. He ends up in the Comorian island of Johanna, as the English used to call it in the 19th century. He becomes friends with the local Sultan, serves as his doctor for a little while. And the Sultan is a very business-minded guy, right? So he wants to use American and British enterprise to start sugar agribusinesses on his island. And so he offers land as well as enslaved labor to Benjamin Wilson. And so Wilson becomes this enormously wealthy sugar planter, using enslaved labor. And for a while, he gets the reputation in the United States as this sort of island despot. But in fact, the story we tell is that his position in the end turns out to be rather tenuous and precarious. His island home, his adopted island home, passes from sultanate to French imperialism. And amid the international politics of abolition, domestic wars of succession, a slave insurrection, he finds himself floundering between conflicting norms of labor tenure and labor regulation, land tenure, contractual obligation. And so he keeps appealing to the U.S. government to send a man of war to protect his, essentially his estate. And officially anti-slavery U.S. government, of course, is insufficiently invested in the Western Indian Ocean to commit blood or resources to defend this native son's claims to private property and American patriotism. Especially because he employs enslaved labor.
Now, this story of Dr. Wilson raises the tantalizing possibility that post-1865, post the ostensible abolition of enslavement in the U.S. as a result of the U.S. Civil War, that many would-be enslavers moved on to other areas. And I'm wondering, do you have any reflections on that? Was Dr. Benjamin Wilson unique, peculiar, unusual, or was he symptomatic of a wider trend?
Well, I think we need to do a good bit of research for the Indian Ocean piece of the story. Now, other historians have already talked about how ex-Confederates moved to places like Brazil to rejuvenate their slaveholding fortunes after the American Civil War. What makes Benjamin Wilson such a fascinating character was that, he was, of course, a Union surgeon. And exactly at the time the United States is experimenting very briefly and tenuously with racial democracy during Reconstruction, he is reinventing himself as a slaveholder. Now, what we do know from the histories of American merchants and consuls in the Indian Ocean is that they did business with slaveholders. Some of their Indian business partners, for example, were slaveholders, or at least provided credit to slaveholders. And these American businessmen often vigorously defended the claims of their business partners, slaveholding business partners, be they Arab or Indian, to non-British nationality and to sovereignty. So they defended the slaveholding claims of some of these characters.
Now, what about resistance? To what extent did you uncover abolitionists in the United States objecting to or struggling against this Indian Ocean-wide trade in enslaved Africans?
Yeah. So resistance to slavery and the story of abolition actually proceeded on a number of different levels. So on the one hand, Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, David Ruggles, Sojourner Truth were networked with intercontinental human rights activists on many continents. To give you just one example, they belonged in the same circles as the famous Indian social reformer called Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And through travel, correspondence, and print cultures, these reformers forged a global public square. And there they indicted slavery and colonialism as twin evils in the language of humanitarian reform and sometimes in the language of liberal individualism and a free market for labor. But what they do is they take the colonial state to task for impoverishing the colonized in ways that fostered slavery as a mode of subsistence. And they mounted movements to replace the slave-grown cotton and sugar of quote, the despot-cursed regions of Carolina and Louisiana, unquote, with the free-grown, quote, sugar of Bengal, the rice of Patna, and the cotton of Bombay, unquote. And in fact, interestingly, I discovered that Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who became famous among transatlantic abolitionists, especially within Unitarian circles for his women's rights activism in India, emerges in some American abolitionist publications as a symbol in arguments for racial equality. Following the Nat Turner insurrection in Virginia, for instance, one opinion piece in The Liberator argued against Black deportation from North America in the name of, quote, one of the most enlightened of the human race now living, though not a white man, namely Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So you have those, but we also write about, I don't know how much time we have, but we write about women and children who used the language and institutions of imperial abolition to resist, to reinvent themselves, to define freedom. Whether it was Mary Ann Shadd Carey in North America, or, the 15-year-old Mariana, who was from Southeast Africa, who was found hidden amid consignments of gum incense and limestone aboard an Arab vessel when it docked in the Arabian seaport of Porbandar.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor SenGupta, co-author of the book Sojourners, Sultans, and Slaves, what's next on your research agenda?
Okay, so I'm now writing about Afro-Asian interactions, but particularly solidarities in North America. So I'm returning to my roots as a U.S. historian. And I'm actually focused on this person called William Johnson. I don't know, he became famous in the late 19th century as a Black editor in Kentucky. But turns out that he was actually Anglo-Indian. His father was from Manchester, his mother was from Bengal, but he sort of reinvents himself as an African American in North America. And sort of it's not like he was trying to pass. But everyone knew what his origins were, but he sort of throws himself into fights against segregation, against disfranchisement. And so it's quite a fascinating story about race in translation on different sides of the Atlantic.
Well, just as a footnote, you may want to follow up on, in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, I talk about the man regarded as the first so-called U.S. settler in what becomes the state of Washington, who apparently was of South Asian descent himself, although he's defined as a U.S. Negro. So apparently what happens to Mr. Johnson may have been part of a larger trend. In any case, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor SenGupta, Professor of History at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, co-author of the book Sojourners, Sultans, and Slaves. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this and look forward to talking more.
Ditto.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Ayana Omilade Flewellen. Thank you, Daniel Domingues and Gunja SenGupta. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne. Thank you, Brother Brandon. Thank you to our board op and all those who made today's program possible. For your interviews today on Freedom Now, this program as well as prior programs can be reheard for the next 60 days. You can go to kpfk.org, audio archive, scroll to Freedom Now. Until next week, signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And as always, we stand ready for revolution.